This video was designed to accompany the Principles of Data Visualization worksheet, which contained graphs and visualizations from recent reports from the Ministry of Justice. All of those reports are available free online via the links in the worksheet if you want to see the graphs in context. I'll give you some detailed solutions. They're far from exhaustive, but they're just some thoughts that I had about the visualizations, about what works well and how they could be improved. The first example was a line graph taken from the Offender Management Statistics Report in 2023. It showed the prison populations between 2003 and 2023, which was split by those who were sentenced and those who were on remand. If we begin with the good things about this graph, it shows the data in a simple but effective and clear way. We can see a clear message from this that the populations in prisons increased from the beginning of the period up to around 2011, at which point it remained fairly stable until 2023, when there was a sharp decrease in the number of sentenced, probably due to the closure of courts during the COVID pandemic. And we can see how this relationship across time has changed following the reopening of the courts. We can also see that they have a fairly minimal design. So there are grid lines on here, but they are only horizontal. So that means that we can easily see the differences across time, even at the end of the time period, and relate it back to that y-axis. There are some issues with this plot though. First and foremost, the text is very small, so it's not particularly accessible. We would like to see that increase to match those guidelines introduced in the materials. Also, we would like to see some annotations to better explain the reasons for changes in patterns. So we are assuming that the decrease in the number of sentenced prisoners was due to the closure of courts, but it would be good to annotate exactly where that happened. Also, due to the long term of this data, there's probably some policies that have been introduced during that time, and it would be interesting to see where those change things. In addition, because of the large difference between the two groups, it's really quite hard to see the small differences across time within each of them separately. There's a few ways we could try to overcome this. We could maybe show a graph of them separately, which would allow us to zoom in on the effects. The issue is this would have to be on different scales, so wouldn't really make them comparable. The alternative would be to give them as stacked bar charts. So each bar would represent the total prison population, so we could keep that information, but then this bar would consist of two bars making up the remand and sentenced, and we could see how those change across time while comparing it across each of the groups. This chart is also taken from the Offender Management Statistics in 2023, and it shows the number of offenders under the Probation Service supervision from 2013 up to 2023. The good things about this plot is, first of all, again, it is very clear. The colour palette is distinct and we can clearly see the differences between groups. They've added an annotation to identify where a very important policy was introduced and where that had an impact on the numbers, so we can clearly see that message from this graph. Issues with the graph though, again, accessibility. This text is not large enough when we see it in print, so we would want that the text to be increased in size to at least 12 points. Also, the differences across time within the groups is quite difficult to see. So this policy that was introduced, the Offender Rehabilitation Act, it was to increase the number of post-release supervisions, but we can't really see if that is the case because of the changes in the numbers of the different groups. So potentially a line graph would be helpful here that we saw in the previous page. But as the values are closer together, it would be a lot easier to interpret the differences between groups, unlike the previous graph, which maybe would have been better shown as a stacked bar chart like this. This example is taken from the Criminal Court Statistics Quarterly, and it shows the proportion of outstanding cases at the Crown Court grouped by the age of the case, so how long it has been through the court system, between 2014 and 2023. Starting with the good parts of this graph, it shows the data in a pretty clear way. So there is a very clear message here that the longer term cases has increased dramatically since 2020. Again, probably related to the closure of courts during the COVID pandemic, but we can clearly see a change in the proportion of the age groups across the time. Things that, again, are not so good with this, once again, the text is very, very small and should be increased. Another issue is the use of bars here. Because there are so many of them and because of the colours that have been used, this creates what's known as a moire pattern. That is a pattern which tricks our mind into thinking that the image is moving in some way. This can make it quite unpleasant to look at for any length of time. It makes it hard to interpret it and get the full message out of it. So my advice here would be to join up those bars to remove that moire effect and to use a stacked area plot instead, because it's a very clear image that they are showing, a very clear message. It's just this pattern is really getting in the way of things. And once again, the use of annotations would really help here, because it would help us see where that closure of courts happened, so we can pinpoint exactly where this change happened, and potentially comparing the proportions at the beginning of the time period to the end with some kind of annotation. The final example is taken from the Justice Data Lab analysis, and it's looking at reoffending behaviour after support from Only Connect, which is an intervention which was trialled to try and reduce the reoffending behaviour of prisoners after they were released from prison. So it's showing a comparison of the 1 year proven reoffending rate between those who had the support and those who did not, the control group. One thing that this has done really well is that rather than using a standard bar chart, they've actually used people. And making that non-standard graph has not lost any information, but in fact has made it more compelling and interesting. It draws our attention in more because it's different than what we're used to see. There are many annotations that are used, which helps convey the important messages, talking about quantifying these differences, not just in numeric terms, but also in English as well, non-significant differences between groups. So we can clearly see all of the information. The text is larger than the previous examples. The light colour is slightly more difficult to see than the dark colour, but I'm not sure that is an issue here given the amount of annotation that they've used. So this is a really good example of how to use a non-standard graph without losing any information and making it less compelling. I hope these solutions were useful. As I said, they are not exhaustive and they are totally based on my opinions. The intention of this worksheet was for you to see real data visualizations, to think about what makes a visualization compelling, clear, informative, and also to think about how data visualizations can be improved. Remember that even making slight tweaks to a visualization can make it a lot more compelling, make it informative, ensure the data, we have integrity in the data, and also ensuring that it is accessible and inclusive for everyone.